psychological state rather than what is your mental health, right? We shouldn't care if what we call it should be perfectly fine. But here's the thing. When we want to know about your psychological state, we have to ask you, right? I have to do things like say, Maddie, are you happy today? Are you sad today? Are you worried today? Well, I have to ask. And then we have to trust that when I ask, that each of you will be truthful and give me the correct answer. You will be truthful with yourself, okay? So it is self-reporting. That's one of our issues, okay? I can't bring you to the lab and test in some ways how worried you are or your feelings of self-worth. I can't put you on a bike and test that, okay? Those are objective measures. So you have to tell us, and it is subjective. And part of what being subjective means is we could say, Camilla could tell us that she is sad, and Taylor could say, yes, I am also sad, but their individual experience of what that feels like, what the thought process involved in that is, may be very, very different. And they may depend upon a whole host of life experience, genetics, a whole host of things. And so again, because it's subjective and because you have to be truthful, it's a little bit trickier for us to try to measure these things. And I'll talk about why that is important and why that changes the way we word questionnaires and why we ask like 40 questions when we could probably really only ask 2 if you were going to be super truthful to get things, okay? Other things to keep in mind, okay? A psychological state, okay? A psychological state is, in many ways, how do you feel right now, okay? How do you feel right now? Is Hallie bored with what I'm saying, given her posture? I'm making an assumption. How does she feel right now? She may not be bored in general, but she may not be bored for like 3 weeks, but right now that's what you're doing, okay? So we need to ask ourselves, is what you're feeling transitory, okay? Is it a state or is it more permanent, right? I'm always bored. I'm always worried. Yes, me, hand up, okay? Always worried. There's going to be a difference between what we would call a psychological state and a psychological trait. Things that are more like traits last a long time, okay? So we got to figure out what's happening. Are you sad because you're not a sociopath? Your dog died yesterday, okay? Something like that. There's plenty of reasons to feel whatever it is that we're feeling, and it may, be around for a little bit. But then there are other things that are going to be much more permanent, and it's these permanent things that we're going to have potentially some big effects on. We also need to, if possible, try to quantify not just are you feeling something, but how strongly are you feeling? I'm a little bit happy, right? Or I'm super happy, right? I'm the happiest I've ever been in my entire life. Or I'm happy, it's fine, right? On a continuum. And so I'll show you guys some scales that we use and how we try to go about that. So you have to tell us what you're feeling. Your experience may be different than other people's. It's subjective, okay? We need to understand so we can figure out the effects of exercise or being sedentary on, is what you're feeling transitory? Is it more permanent? And what's the intensity? Is it here or not? But also to what extent, okay? All right. So in the psychological world, we're going to talk about moods versus emotions, okay? And so moods tend to be sustained feelings, minutes to days, okay? Right? We say about my daughter, she's in a mood. What we really mean is she's having emotions. When we talk about her having a mood, it's like she's tired and she's cranky because she hasn't slept enough and she's hungry. But a mood, for the most part, is something that lasts. Minutes is kind of the narrow end of the definition, but really it would be like several hours to probably multiple days or weeks, okay? An emotion is a much more shorter term kind of thing, okay? We could have Haley smack Mitchell in the back of the head with her computer, and that might evoke an emotion out of Mitchell, right? It might be anger, it might be pain, it might, whatever, okay? Something there. Maybe he likes it. I don't really know. I want to speak for Mitchell, but that would be an emotion. But in the half an hour, he's like, whatever, I've moved on, I'm fine. It's not a mood, okay? So when we talk about like an anxiety disorder or depressive disorders or something, what we're really talking about are mood disorders. Generally, mood disorders are negative feelings that are going to be sustained for weeks or months. And negative is a very broad term. Negative can mean worry. Negative can mean angry. Negative can mean sad. Negative can mean feelings of low self-worth or self-esteem. It can encompass a lot of different things, okay? So mood disorders, most of the things that we think of as kind of mental health challenges or something are really going to be these mood disorders, okay? So as we said, to learn about how you're feeling, we have to ask you questions, okay? I can say, Bria, are you feeling on this continuum generally today unpleasant or pleasant? You can answer if you want, you don't have to. Pretty pleasant. You're somewhere over, right, on this kind of side of things. So I can ask very general, right? Are you having positive feelings today or negative feelings today? Okay? Or we can say very specifically, right? Rhea, are you anxious or are you calm? Are you depressed and sad or are you happy? So we can ask these things on a continuum. You have to anchor these scales, okay? Provide definitions of what these things are and say between these two things, where would you fall? Okay? That's a lot of how we're going to get this. And so it's like, okay, you are generally pleasant, but then we can ask you the same thing. On a scale from 0 to 100, how pleasant are you? What's the intensity of that pleasantness? So we can kind of go back and forth. Okay? One of the things that I gave you guys, one of the things that's on Canvas, that if we had more time, or if you guys want to do this, you can, is I put a couple of questionnaires. One of those questionnaires is something called the Profile of Mood States, okay? Or we abbreviate it as the POMS, the P-O-M-S. So the POMS questionnaire that I gave you guys is 30 questions, okay? It asks 5 questions about 6 different dimensions or 6 different moods, okay? It asks about anxiety, depression, anger, fatigue, confusion, and then something called vigor, which is kind of like asking about how energetic you feel. So it has 5 negative moods and 1 positive mood. And the POMS quantifies intensity, okay? Not just do you have it, but if you've got it, to what extent. So you rate from 0, meaning I don't have this at all the way up to 4. And it gives you these series of like questions or these series of statements, okay? And so there's going to be 5 things that we add up together to get at anxiety, okay? 5 that we add up to be depression. And you're going to say, like, over the past week, how often have you worried about possible misfortunes? How often have you not felt calm or something like that? Okay. By asking more than one question about each little dimension or each mood, it gives us a chance to make sure that you are being truthful about what you're feeling, right? If I ask you how calm you've been, and you say, I have not been calm, and then I ask you how anxious you've been, and you say, yes, I've been very anxious, those two things are very congruent, right? If I've been anxious, I've not been calm. And so it provides a check on kind of how these questions work. And so when you score the POMS, we can get a score for each individual dimension, okay? Which of these things are you or are you not feeling, and to what extent? But then we can also add up all of the negative moods and subtract the positive mood from it and get some idea of a very general how disturbed or how disordered in a negative manner has your mood been over some period of time. Okay? We'll come back and look at some of this, some data on all of this at the end of class. I can use your scores on the palms to decide how hard you need to work out today or not work out today. It's very, very useful, especially in athletes who are doing kind of high volumes of training. Some really fascinating stuff that's going to be there. Okay? All right. Let's talk a little bit now more specifically about anxiety and about depression. Okay? I'm very open, I'm very honest. I am afflicted with anxiety all the time. Okay? Anxiety disorders are the most common type of mood disturbance or emotional illness in the US. Okay? About 20% of people in the US will develop an anxiety disorder that requires some form of treatment. Okay? So 1 in 5. Epidemiologically, the group that is the most likely to experience anxiety, or at least be willing to report their anxiety to us, are college-aged white women. Okay? We don't know if that's reporting bias. We don't know if there's something in particular, ladies, about your existence as college-age individuals, probably to some extent about what's going on there, but that's what the data tell us, okay? Women tend to be more anxious than men. I don't know that I believe that. I think the women are just more willing to be honest about that, but that's what it tells us, okay? There's about $45 billion in healthcare costs associated with anxiety, from not being able to go to work because you're so worried you can't leave bed, from going to therapy, from taking different prescriptions, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a big deal, okay? It tends to be more common, as I said, in women, more common in Caucasians than other ethnic groups. We think there's a lot of reporting bias in this, okay? There are sort of gender norms or sex norms about what it's okay to admit to feeling. We've gotten better about that, especially in folks that are y'all's age, okay? And then potentially it seems to be a little more quote unquote acceptable in sort of people that are of Caucasian descent to admit to these kinds of things for a host of reasons that we could teach a whole class about, okay? But that's just what the data tell us, all right? So what is anxiety? It may come as a surprise to you guys. I think I've had an anxiety disorder my entire life. I did not realize that until I was a graduate student, okay? It did not occur to me that my subjective feelings of apprehension, worry, and tension were not what everyone else was experiencing. I just thought this is the thing. I'd had like 3 classes in psychology and a whole bunch of stuff. And I was taking an exercise psychology class as a PhD student before I realized, oh shit, I think I have generalized anxiety disorder. What is this? Okay, so very common, but it's worry, okay? Sometimes that worry is directed at a particular thing, sometimes it's not, all right? So it's not fear, all right? It's not fear because your apprehension and your worry typically lasts longer and occurs without some sort of obvious external stimulus, okay? So phobias, like I'm afraid of spiders. I am afraid of spiders. I hate spiders. I hate snakes. I hate spiders. No thank you, okay? Also really don't like things in the water underneath me that I can't see. So I got a lot of things. I've watched too many shows on Discovery, like World's Most Deadly, like tarantulas, or really not going to Australia because basically everything there will kill you, right? The world's most deadly snake and spider and jellyfish and the sharks and anyway. But those are phobias, okay? When there's an obvious external stimulus against which you are afraid, that's a type of anxiety disorder, but it is not sort of this generalized kind of thing, okay? We can argue in some ways like, well, what do I worry about then? Well, I worry about everything. And one of those things is this great sort of nebulous unknown that is out there in the world, like what will or could happen in the future. they would say, the psychologists would say that that's not really fear. That's not an obvious external stimulus. That's just kind of me generally doing these things. So that's what it is, okay? In a lot of instances, though, anxiety is going to be accompanied by changes in the autonomic nervous system. You worry about something, your body has a fight or flight response. You release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so with anxiety, especially if you're acutely having a high level of anxiety, we might actually be able to measure some changes in the lab in heart rate or blood pressure or skin, like the sweat coming out of your skin. You can't, it's not like you're just like pouring sweat, but there's some small, subtle changes that we may be able to detect, okay? So we can talk about state anxiety versus trait anxiety. Anybody have a test this week? I think y'all were supposed to, but okay. So you have a test this week, and any of you worried about that test? Okay. Those of you that raised your hands, I appreciate that. Okay. You guys have what we would probably call state anxiety, right? You're worried about that test. Once you take that test and you feel like you did well, you're going to stop worrying about that test. Okay. That's state anxiety. Trait anxiety is what I have. Now, if you have trait, you also have lots of state, but I have trait anxiety. I'm worried all the time. Always worried about something all the time, okay? So trait lasts very long. State is going to be kind of how are you feeling today? Is it going to come and go to some extent? These two things are not mutually exclusive. People that have very, very high trait anxiety also tend to have very high state anxiety because you're going to choose to worry about lots of kind of short-term things that maybe other people don't, okay? Very, very common. So what causes this? We don't really know. Neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain, potentially. Is there differences in how the brain processes or kind of cognitive processing of these external stimuli or kind of stressful events? Is there things about your environment? Are there genetic things? Probably. Other stuff that we don't fully understand. It's hard for us to test things in the brain, okay? I can make you think about things that would make you anxious. I can put you in an MRI unit, and I can measure what parts of your brain are active and involved in that. And some of us that have more anxiety are going to have kind of this hyperactivity in certain areas. But even from that, it's hard for us to really and truly understand kind of what is causing all of this, okay? And in some ways, it doesn't really matter what's causing it. The big issue is what is it doing to us and how can we sort of deal with it in the most kind of positive way. So anxiety disorder is the most common is generalized anxiety disorder. This is what I have. People have phobias. People have what's called panic disorder. You may have panic attacks. You could have generalized anxiety disorder or a phobia and still have panic attacks, but there's this thing called panic disorder that is a little kind of longer term. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, is a form of anxiety disorder. Okay, and then post-traumatic stress is also going to, in some ways, tend to be classified as an anxiety disorder. And so these are all going to kind of have similar sorts of things that are going to look like on the outcome. Okay. What I'm showing you here are the guidelines from something called the DSM. It's the Diagnostic Something Manual, or the Diagnostic Symptom Manual, I think is what it's called. But this is the book that they give to therapists or to psychiatrists that we use to diagnose people with particular psychological disorders. This is the one for generalized anxiety disorder. Unrealistic or excessive worry about 2 or more life circumstances for at least 6 months. Difficulty controlling or coping with your anxiety and worry. The source of anxiety is not specifically due to panic, social phobia, obsession and compulsion, or weight gain. Okay? Not to say you don't worry about these things, but it is not specifically only about those. And then the presence on most days over the previous 6 months of the following symptoms: feeling tense, wound up, and restless, easily fatigable, trouble concentrating, irritable, having some muscle tension, and then potentially difficulty with sleeping. Okay? So if you have these, or some combination of these, you probably have generalized anxiety disorder. Okay? And so how all of this manifests itself, and you're going to ask me what does unrealistic or excessive mean? I don't really know. That's kind of a gray area that we have to try to wade our way through. Okay? Anxiety disorders, or anxiety, has two different dimensions. It has a cognitive dimension, or kind of what your thought process looks like, and then a somatic, or an actual physical symptom side. Okay? So I want all of you to think about a time that you were anxious. Okay? Think about a time you were anxious. Think about when you took a big test that you were really worried about, or you had to get up and talk in front of class and do a presentation, or you're on a first date with somebody that you really like and you're a little bit nervous, like something like that, okay? And think about how often you had any of these things. So cognitive this is sort of thought process, right? I feel calm, I feel tense, I feel nervous, I feel relaxed, right? What are you thinking and kind of feeling based upon that thought process? I'm presently worrying over possible misfortunes, right? Are you running through things in your head, like what happens if I fail this test? Or what happens if I say the wrong word during my presentation, right? Are people going to laugh at me, or are they going to think that I don't know what I'm doing? Like whatever that might be, okay? This is a thought process kind of thing, okay? I do a lot of this. I do a lot of the last one. Presently worrying over possible misfortunes, especially when I'm driving in the car, or especially when I'm trying to go to sleep at night, right? Like my mind just races and runs over and over all of these different scenarios, right? But then there are also some what we would call somatic, and they can be measured on something called the body awareness scale, but physical manifestations of your anxiety. My heart is pounding, okay? My mouth is dry. My hands are shaky. My vision is blurred. I feel cold, okay? We've moved blood flow kind of from the exterior away and those kinds of things. So you very often will have both of these things. So there's going to be these physical manifestations of your anxiousness as well as your cognitive or kind of thought process manifestations of all of these things, okay? And so the cognitive ones are very often measured using something called the STAI, or the State Trait Anxiety Index. On Canvas, I put a copy of the STAI on there for you. It asks you 20 questions about how anxious are you right now, and then it asks 20 questions about how anxious are you in general. So it gets at state anxiety, are you worried right now, and trait anxiety, how anxious are you in general. We can use that questionnaire. Maybe it would make you nervous to think about taking it. We can use that questionnaire and take your scores on the trait side of it and get a very reasonable approximation of if you have generalized anxiety or not. Okay? So it's a thing where you can get a score out of 80, you get up to 4 points on your 20 questions. I usually hover in like the mid-60s. On all of that. The cutoff for an anxiety disorder is like the mid-40s on that. And you can get from 20 to 80. If you're over like in the kind of high 40s or above, there's a reasonable chance you have generalized anxiety disorder. So usually in class, if I'd had time, I would have printed them, we would have brought them, we would have all scored them, and then I show you guys my score, and I usually have the highest score of anybody in the room. And say like, see, it's okay, we can kind of all get through all of this. All right, let's talk about exercise and anxiety just for a few minutes though, okay? So things to remember, all right? What dimension of anxiety are we gonna look at in relation to exercise and physical activity? So what you're feeling right at this exact moment, so state anxiety versus trait anxiety, okay? What sample? Who are our people? Are they people like me that have an anxiety disorder? Or are they people that don't have an anxiety disorder who may just be feeling anxious at that particular time? When are we measuring? Are we measuring during exercise? Are we measuring right after? Are we measuring several hours after? And then how many times? We're just getting kind of one measurement of it, or we're going to do kind of multiple. Okay? So here is some interesting old data that I want you guys to see. Okay? Here we have scores on the State Trait Anxiety Index. Okay? And what you can see is these are in people that do not have anxiety disorders. Here, the white line is kind of the national average of people that don't have anxiety disorders, where they score kind of in the high 30s. So these two groups of people, they don't really have anything. Okay? Blue is our controls. They just sat. They did nothing for 3 hours. Okay? Our red line is going to be people that they sat, we measured them, we had them do a bout of cycling, and then we looked at them for another 3 hours after all of that. So what you guys will see, the real take home is they weren't anxious before. Exercising makes me anxious. Okay? It's a strange thing. Okay? Part of that we think is because a lot of the somatic symptoms of anxiety, like increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, those things mimic what happens when you're anxious. So generally, when you ask people while they are exercising, they report this kind of small but significant increase in their anxiety, their feelings of anxiety, while they're doing their bout of exercise. Okay? It's interesting, we don't really understand it, but then you will note they came back down as soon as they stopped, and they really didn't see anything else. They're not different at the end than they were when they started. Okay? This is very common. If you are not anxious to begin with, exercise is going to have no real kind of longer-term effect on your anxiety. Okay? Kelly doesn't have an anxiety disorder. She's not anxious right now. We have her go run. Nothing's going to change. Okay? However, if you are anxious, whether trait anxious or state anxious, like I'm worried about my test tomorrow, okay? I'm not normally an anxious person, but I'm worried about my test tomorrow. I have state anxiety. Or if you're me, I just have trait all the time. If I go and exercise, then we are both going to feel less anxious. Okay? All people seem to experience this regardless of age, regardless of sex, regardless of whether you are a new or a regular exerciser, and regardless of whether you are a low or a high anxious person. Okay? If you are worried about something right now, go for a walk, go for a run, you'll feel less anxious. Okay? There may be a couple of you that won't, but in general, everybody feels less anxious with their state anxiety after a bout of exercise. Aerobic exercise of almost any intensity, it can be walking, it can be running, it can be cycling, it doesn't matter. And then resistance training, go lift weights. Okay? Weirdly, when you lift weights, the drop in anxiety seems to be delayed about 2 hours afterwards. When you do aerobics, you feel better almost instantly. Okay? What's going on here, we don't really know, but it is very commonly observed. Okay? So pretty much any kind of exercise or any kind of physical activity will work to make you less anxious if you are kind of feeling worried. Okay? So here's some very old data, and I say very old, but right, like as old as you guys in a lot of instances, published in 1998. And what you can see is this is 10 weeks of exercise training. On the y-axis is the person's score on something called the Hamilton Anxiety Scale. It's not exactly the STAI. You can't use this to diagnose, but it's very, very kind of widely used. The higher your score, the more anxious you were feeling. Here we have these people. These were people with an anxiety disorder. 3 groups. A group in white that got a placebo. So we just gave them a pill, but it didn't have anything in it. They took that pill for 10 weeks. We have the group in the black squares here that did aerobic cycle training like 3 times a week. And then we had this group in the black circles with the dashed line that took an anti-anxiety drug called clomipramine. Okay? Clomipramine is the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Weirdly enough, we gave it to one of our cats for anger. He was very like, I want to attack everyone. he was a shit, let me tell you. He was real mean. We gave him clomipramine, and it actually seemed to even him out a little bit. It was real weird. And what you will note is that both the exercise group and the clomipramine group sort of reduced their anxiety over 10 weeks to a relatively similar extent. And our placebo group, they kind of followed the same path for about a month, and then they went back to normal. Placebos work. They didn't know what they were getting, but there was this placebo effect of like, hey, I'm in a study, they're giving me something, maybe it's going to work. And so they felt better for a little while, which was real, but then after a while, the fact there was no active ingredient, they kind of went back to normal, okay? So this is just showing, at least in this particular study, and it's been widely reproduced, that exercise is roughly as good in just about everybody at reducing anxiety as taking anxiety-reducing medication, okay? As taking anxiety-reducing medication. So, why does it work? We don't know. The short answer is we really don't know, okay? There's a lot of sort of potential physiological or kind of cognitive thought process explanations. People have mentioned something called endogenous opioids or endorphins, that you go and you exercise and you release these endorphins, which most of us don't. Actually, the idea of like a runner's high is a myth. It's not a real thing. It does not exist, okay, in anything else. But we can very easily give you a drug to block the effects of these endorphins. It's the same drug they give people that are addicted to opioid medication. And we can give people a dose of that. We can block the endorphins, and for the most part, they still see a decrease in anxiety. There's a chance that it helps to alter in the brain your levels of what we call the monoamines, so serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA, and some other things that are going on in there. There's a chance that that happens, but the measurement of this is a little bit difficult and kind of tricky. Strangely enough, there's a chance that simply raising your core body temperature makes you less anxious. Any of you, when you're anxious, like take a hot shower or a hot bath or anything? Okay, a couple of you guys, maybe feel less anxious afterwards, more relaxed. It's the same thing. You're raising your core body temperature. Exercise raises your core body temperature. There is some support for that. They're trying to have people run and then put them in a suit to keep their core body temperature down. They don't see quite as big of a dip. It's really kind of interesting. For people that do exercise in groups, we think that the social interaction may, in fact, be one of those things that makes you feel better. I'm going with a partner, I'm going in a group, there's all these people, right? We're supporting each other. It's nice to talk to somebody or to have somebody to share this miserable exercise experience with, okay? One of the big things to me that we can kind of talk until we're blue in the face on the safety and efficacy of what people do at CrossFit is, but I think one of the real benefits of CrossFit is there does seem to be this real sense of sort of community. People go and they work out together and they push each other, and they're kind of real, like, friends in the midst of all of this. And I think that's really important. That can be really helpful for a lot of people. So social interaction may make that better. And then this feeling of achievement. I went, I exercised, I did something good today, right? Or I ran faster or farther than I ever have. That's good. I feel better about myself because I did that one thing, which is very real, okay? And then the one my wife likes to cite that she thinks works for her is distraction, okay? If we make Taylor run at a high intensity, at some point, okay, and there's real psychological evidence of this, your brain can only process so much information at one given time, okay? You guys want to watch me make Taylor do something that's as cognitively challenging as anything in the entire world? Oh, it's supposed to be on your head and saying yes. Okay, Taylor, are you very good at math? Okay, not really? Okay, I'm going to give you an odd 4-digit number, okay? An odd 4-digit number. So we're going to say 3,201. Okay? What I want you to do is count backwards by sevens. Okay? Count backwards by sevens. All right? Are you ready? No? All we would have to do, okay, is ask any of you guys, take an odd 4-digit number, count backwards by sevens. That is as cognitively challenging an activity as anything you will ever do in your life, okay? That requires as much activation of your brain as anything else that we do. If I ask you to do this while you're exercising, if you're walking, you can, for the most part, still do it at a reasonably similar level as when you're sitting at rest. If I ask you to do it while you're jogging, we get to about 60% of VO2 max. I ask you to do it while you're jogging, and you suddenly begin to lose the ability to do it while also maintaining that pace while you're jogging, okay? And so exercise, especially at a certain level, requires enough of your cognitive processes to maintain that exercise that you can no longer expend cognitive energy or cognitive sort of space on whatever else it was that you were worrying about. You can't focus on both things simultaneously. And so that's one of the things that exercise does, is it distracts you, okay? By distracting you, you're not thinking about it, you give your brain a little bit of a break, and maybe then you can kind of move on and put some of that stuff behind you, at least for a little while, and you feel better because you've not just been sitting there like stressed out over all of that, okay? My guess is that some of you do that, like I do. I have a 45-minute car ride home, and I'm going to sit there and replay in my mind the conversation that I just had with Dr. Mike, our department chair, where he expressed that he wasn't satisfied with something, and I'm going to think about it, I'm going to obsess about it and go over and over and over again and try to map out what I need to do tonight or tomorrow, or how can I make that better, right? Does that sound familiar to anybody? Some of you guys do things like that, okay? But if I go run, if I wasn't in the car, if I was riding my bike home, that's a pretty good thing, I can't do that. And so my mind gets a little bit of a break, and I feel a little bit less anxious because of that. Okay? So the actual answer for how exercise works is probably some combination of all of these things together. Okay? And in some ways, the how and the why really doesn't matter. If you feel less anxious, that's the point, right? When you're really anxious, you're not thinking, oh, man, my serotonin levels are really kind of messed up in relation to my dopamine levels. And so what you really want is, I want to not feel like this. I want to feel better. So who cares how you get to that place? It's just, okay, I'm going to go take a walk, or I'm going to go for a jog, right? Or I'm going to go to cycle bar and they're going to yell at me. I'm going to get on the Peloton, whatever. Okay? That's the thing. Okay? That's the thing. All right. Questions about anxiety? No? No questions? Okay. So we will kind of just keep going here, since I apologize, we started class a little bit late. We're just going to kind of push through. Now we're going to talk about depression, okay? So, depression is, I don't know that it's necessarily the second most common type of psychological illness, but it is in many ways probably the most dangerous one. So I like for us to talk about this one, okay? It's also in some ways the one most widely studied in relation to exercise, okay? So depression is prolonged, intense, and overwhelming feelings of sadness and loss of pleasure in activities. And we'll talk about how that plays in to the definition or the diagnostic criteria in just a second, okay? Unlike anxiety, depression tends to come and go a little bit more often, which is good and bad. So About 1 in 3 people will have a level of depression that probably requires some sort of treatment in their life. So 1 in 3 of you guys, okay? So it tends to affect somewhere between maybe 5 and 10% of the general population at any point. Economic cost is about $40 billion a year from lost work productivity because you're depressed and you can't get out of bed and you can't do things, to actual treatment. The problem with depression, 1 in 3 of you will have it. Of those of you that have it, only 1 in 3 will ever seek treatment for it. And of those of you that seek treatment, only 1 in 3 of those people will find that treatment to be effective. So lots of people have it. Most people don't try to get treatment, and even when you do, treatment is not particularly effective, which will show later on. Exercise is about as good as anything else, so maybe we need to be spending more time doing it. Okay, so I say that this is the one that in some ways tends to have kind of the gravest consequences, is because depression is the thing that leads to suicide in a lot of instances. Okay? This is the one that can have the most debilitating and kind of the most long-term impacts of things. Okay? Diagnostic criteria for depression, a little bit different than anxiety from a time frame standpoint. Okay? And so you have to have one of these first 2 symptoms and 5 of 7 of these kind of second group of symptoms, okay, almost daily for just 2 weeks. Remember, anxiety is like 6 months, okay, 6 months. Depression is just for 2 weeks. Sad mood of the day, nearly every day, and or loss of interest and pleasure in previously enjoyed. Okay? So one of these 2 over on most days over the last 2 weeks, and then 5 of these 7, okay? Significant change in appetite or body weight, insomnia or hypersomnia. So I either can't sleep or I sleep all the time. I am either very lethargic or I'm very agitated. Again, kind of 2 sides of the same coin. I have lots of fatigue or loss of energy. I feel worthless or guilty. I have difficulty thinking or concentrating, and potentially recurrent thoughts of death or suicide, which very often gets tied in with this feelings of worthlessness and excessive guilt. It's these kinds of things, okay, that tend to make depression so dangerous. Okay? But it's just for 2 weeks. Okay? There is a reasonable chance that several of you in here have been depressed at some point in your life because of the death of a family member or someone that you care about, or because of a breakup in a relationship, brother, sister, mom, dad, boyfriend, girlfriend, right? Someone you were close to, friend, okay? These are things, and you're that way for a little while, and then eventually you kind of come out of it, okay? And so that part is very common. Well, the thing we have to be very, very careful of is this feelings of worthlessness and guilt and the recurrent thoughts of death or suicide, okay? So, who tends to get depressed? Well, depression, even more so than anxiety, kind of has family history. If you have a close relative who has had depression, you are at a higher risk, okay? Unsurprisingly, a recent loss or major stressful life event, okay? Especially one that may revolve around a close relationship. People who feel like they lack a close relationship, okay? Friend, family, boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, whatever, something like that, okay? Especially if maybe you've lost one of those, that tends to be a thing. Being female, especially in this age range, and being a woman who has recently given birth, okay? We could again spend a very large amount of time talking about something called postpartum depression, okay? One of our family, like our best friends in the world, a girl my wife and I went to college with, and then she also was doing grad school in Georgia with us. But when she had her daughter almost 4 years ago, she had postpartum depression for like 6 months afterwards, and it was really, really, really bad. And so we don't think about all of this. A lot of kind of your birth classes and things don't talk about what's going on there, or kind of understand. We do a lot of understanding this a natural thing to feel, but these are the people that tend to kind of be in that range. So what do we know about exercise and depression? There's been about 1,200 studies over the last 40 or 50 years. They're kind of all kinds. There's cross-sectional. There's these prospective where we follow people. There's single bout studies. There's training studies. We compare exercise to other types of treatment. The general consensus is exercise is good for depressive symptoms. Okay? So people that are more active tend to report having fewer symptoms of depression. Okay? This seems to be the case in men and in women, in old people, and in young people. Okay? So that is just kind of where we are. All right? So we look at exercise training. If you're not depressed, we tend to not see further drops in your depressive symptoms. But if you have a person who has somewhat to very elevated depressive scores, exercise training does tend to reduce those, and the benefits appear to be similar in magnitude if you take medication. Okay, so here's just 60 minutes of aerobic exercise training over about 10 weeks. Here's exercise. There's control. You can see the training went up, so their VO2 max goes up, and their depressive scores are coming down. Pretty standard kinds of things. Okay, here's a group where they had medication, exercise, or the combination of medication and exercise. These are people that had elevated depressive scores. Medication works, exercise works, if there's no kind of additive or combinatory effects of both that are going on there. Okay, but I think this is important. Exercise is just as effective as medication. There's a group of people, and it occurs with both anxiety and depression. There's a group of people, like my mother, who will not go to therapy, who will not take medication, who will not acknowledge my mother has an anxiety disorder. She will not acknowledge that she has this anxiety disorder, right? She refuses to talk to us about it, right? She's perfectly okay with me having one, and me taking medication, and me getting treatment and going to therapy, and all of that. But she sees that she does the exact same things that I do, and yet refuses to admit to any of that. Okay? So, one of the benefits of exercise is, fine, you won't go to the doctor, you won't take medication, you won't do anything, just go exercise, and you'll feel better in a relatively similar manner. Okay? Some of you guys may fall into that. Some of your friends or family or people you care about may fall into that. And so that to me is one of the benefits of exercise. In addition to, it doesn't cost potentially as much. You don't have to have insurance or, any of those kinds of things to do this. This is the one, and I'm going to show this, and I'm just going to try to explain what's happening here. It's kind of a strange graph that I think is really powerful. Okay? These were people that had depression, and it's from this particular study, but they had the folks that did only exercise, people that only took medication, or the folks that did some combination. And what you can see in the black bar here is the percentage of people in that group that recovered. The white bar is the percentage that partially recovered, and then the grayish kind of bar is the ones that relapsed. Okay? Exercise, about 90% of people recovered, and somewhere between 5 and 10% relapsed. With medication, about 60% recovered, so that's good, but about 40% also relapsed. And there's some weird things in the combination. Maybe there's something about the medication that's making the relapse a little bit higher, but I find this to be fascinating and really potentially important, that exercising may give us better longer-term outcomes than simply taking medication. We'll talk a little bit about why that's going to be in this particular slide. So how does exercise or physical activity work against depression? Much like anxiety, we don't know, okay? Does it change your thought processes? Probably. Does it change your self-esteem? We don't talk about self-esteem very much, but self-esteem and self-worth are really kind of tied in with feelings of depression. And if you have a sense of accomplishment from exercise, if you have whatever other things that may make you have low self-esteem, I can't do things, I'm worried about my appearance, I'm worried about sort of weight gain or lack of muscle or whatever those things might be, maybe exercise helps you feel better about yourself and can address some of those things to a better extent than medication. Does it re-regulate norepinephrine or 5-HT is serotonin? Does it re-regulate the monoamines? Probably. Are there neuroendocrine changes in the hypothalamic pituitary axis? Yes. Okay. To what extent these things are going to have there? Maybe a little bit. Does it help to re-regulate circadian rhythms? You guys know what circadian rhythms are? The kind of natural light and dark cycles. When you have trouble at the time changes, when we spring forward and fall back with your sleep schedules, it's because we've just arbitrarily said, oh, it's going to be light for an extra hour, or now it's going to be dark an hour earlier. Circadian rhythms and how those things go. Exposure to sunlight helps to regulate your circadian rhythms, which help to regulate estrogen, especially testosterone, but also serotonin and dopamine and these things. In people that live at very high or very low latitudes, so you live near the North and the South Pole, you don't get daylight, like sunshine and darkness in the same ways that everybody else does, right? If we look in Scandinavia, they have the highest quality of life of any countries in the world. The lowest poverty, the best education systems, the highest socioeconomic status, the highest reported satisfaction with life, self-esteem, all of these things. Yet they also have the highest rate of suicide because they're at these very high latitudes and it's dark 6 months of the year. And there is something about that that seems to lead to depression. Okay? And so maybe you exercise, you go outside, you get some sun, or you exercise, it also seems to help to re-regulate that independent of getting some sun. And that may have some roles in the midst of all of this. Okay? Again, maybe we shouldn't fuss about why it works. The key thing is it works. Okay? I want to finish off with a couple of things here at the very, very end, okay? What you guys see here, these are data from the profile of mood states, and these are from female Marine recruits before, during, and at the very end of Marine basic training, okay? Now, I've never been to basic training, much less been to basic training to be a Marine. But I imagine, right, like this is a pretty stressful, physically and mentally demanding kind of thing. And so what you see, each one of these graphs is a dimension of the POM. So this is fatigue, depression, anger, vigor, tension or anxiety, and confusion. And what you can see is that when they start at week one, at the end of week one, they're very, very high in all of the negative emotions and relatively low in their feelings of energy. And as they progress over this very intense 12-week period, fatigue falls, depression falls, anger falls, confusion, anxiety all fall, energy goes up.
I know that's lying.
You think that's lying, Kelly?
Yes.
I mean,
more pissed off week by week, so.
It is what it is. This is what was reported. Your experience may differ, right? So on all of this. But I like to use this as a way to illustrate that if theoretically, in this particular group of ladies, if basic training, right, can do this and have positive effects, then not also having someone yelling at you and screaming at you and getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and whatever else that they do in there, then potentially, right, we can see some really positive benefits from a more kind of traditional exercise program. Okay? Okay. So things that we see very, very commonly, when you exercise more, your feelings of vigor go up and your feelings of fatigue go down. I was part of one of these seminal studies on this when I was a grad student at the University of Georgia. We see this in sedentary individuals. We tend to see it in people that have clinical conditions that report lots of fatigue, like cancer and cardiovascular disease. So training is good for energy. The more you exercise, the more energy you have, the less fatigue you're going to feel. Okay? Good Lord, why is my arm blowing? Okay. The last little bit, though, that I want to show you guys is what about athletes? Okay? What about athletes? We have a couple of 3 Division I athletes in class with us. Okay? And so we're not going to single you guys out and ask you how you feel, but if we survey a large group of people that are kind of high-level college or professional athletes, if you look at their scores on the profile of mood states, they have a very distinct look to them, and they don't look like your normal average person. Okay? They tend to have less negative mood, less anxiety, less depression, less anger, less fatigue and confusion, and more energy or more vigor than non-athletes. And this has been termed, because of the way the original profile of mood states thing was scored and the lines that were drawn, it was called the Iceberg Profile, because it looks like this. And so these are data that were published in 1977. And so this is from the PALMS, not the one that I gave you guys on Canvas, but from an older version. But you scored it on a thing that looked like this, and then they drew these lines connecting your average score on each of your little dimensions, okay? And so it was scaled so that 50 was average for the adult population, all right? And then we have a group of, these were Division I, this is at the University of Wisconsin, runners, wrestlers, and we'll call them oarsmen, but they're rowers, okay? Rowing is a big deal at the University of Wisconsin, much like here. There's a lake right by their campus. I went in November. It was freaking snowing. They were out there rowing on the lake in the snow, right? They're nuts. These people are crazy, but they're in very good shape. So what you can see, though, is here's tension, okay? So anxiety, depression, anger, vigor, so energy, fatigue, and then confusion. And they score, in general, below the adult average on all of the negative ones, maybe not quite anger, but kind of right there, but especially anxiety, depression, fatigue, and confusion, and above on vigor. So this is, look, it's an iceberg, right? Below the surface, above the surface. So here's where this gets interesting. Okay? When we take these athletes and we start them at the sort of very intense part of training in their season, as they're going to get ready to be in season, okay? And we up how much they train. Guess what happens to this profile? It flips, okay? Their vigor falls, their anxiety, their depression, and their fatigue go up, right? And if we then let them have a couple of days off to rest, it goes back to looking like this. If they start to flip and we have them reduce their training load a little bit, it goes back to looking like this. And so there have been several studies, and I know and I can tell you guys that there are multiple professional sports teams and college teams that give the palms to their athletes a couple of times a week. And they look at what their scores are, and if, as their scores begin to change, as energy falls, and especially depression, begin to go up, then they will titrate or reduce down their training load, give them a day off, do a less kind of intense day in an effort to restore the icebergness of their profile of mood states. And then they will push on their training again, okay? There's a paper where they tested this in the Finnish, so the guys from Finland and the ladies from Finland, on the Finnish Olympic canoeing team. And they took half of them and they based their training on monitoring it with this. The other half, they just did what they thought the training should be. And the ones that got monitored via this, like, beat their previous best times to a much greater extent than the other group did. Okay? And so we can use simple surveys of how you feel today in order to adjust what we ask you to do from a training standpoint to help improve your actual performance. This is as good a thing as any for us to monitor something called overtraining. Okay? We know if we push people too often to too much of an extent too hard, that their performance begins to suffer. Okay? It begins to suffer. But there's not very many good physiological markers of that, but there's really good psychological markers of that. So just some things to keep in mind. Okay? All right. That is that. I thank you for your attention for the entire class. I'll save the mushy goodbye and thank you guys for hanging in there with us and being troopers for the semester and blah, blah, blah. And please come back and see me in the summer or next year if you need things or just to say hi. We'll save that for the day of the final. But no class on Wednesday, okay? We will review or we'll do whatever. If somebody wants to bring something, we'll just, sit in here and hang out. I don't really care, okay? But Wednesday will be review, so please come with questions. I'll have the Zoom thing up. You don't have to come in person if you don't want to, but if you got questions, we'll do it that way. Your project is due on Friday. Test is next Tuesday. Okay? Have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next week.
Yeah.